Right now, at this very moment, there are 318 million human beings on this planet who do not know where their next meal is coming from, and that number is about to get catastrophically worse, and the part that should terrify you is that America is no longer immune. I know that sounds dramatic. I know that sounds like something you would hear on a late-night survivalist channel. But I need you to stay with me here, because every single data point I am about to share with you is sourced from the United Nations, the World Bank, the USDA, and the Congressional Budget Office. And when you see how all of these threads connect, you are going to understand why food security experts around the world are using a word they have not used in decades. That word is famine, not in some distant war-torn country that most Americans cannot find on a map, but in places that are directly connected to the food sitting on your kitchen table right now. The World Food Program released its 2026 Global Outlook, and the headline number should have been front-page news in every newspaper in the country. An estimated 318 million people are facing crisis levels of hunger or worse globally, which is more than double the number recorded in 2019. Of those, 41 million are at emergency levels, meaning they are one step away from starvation. For the first time this century, two simultaneous famines have been confirmed, one in Gaza and one in parts of Sudan. And now the conflict in the Middle East is threatening to push an additional 45 million people into acute food insecurity if oil prices remain above $100 a barrel through mid-2026. We are not talking about people who are mildly inconvenienced at the grocery store. We are talking about hundreds of millions of people around the world who are being pushed toward the edge of survival. And the shockwave from that crisis is heading directly for the United States, because the global food system is not a collection of separate, isolated markets. It is one interconnected machine, and when that machine starts breaking down in one place, every single place connected to it starts to feel it. Your local grocery store looks full right now. The shelves are stocked, the produce section is colorful, and everything appears normal. But that appearance is one of the most dangerous illusions in the American economy, because the reality behind those shelves is far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. Most grocery stores in the United States operate on what the industry calls a just-in-time inventory system. That means they do not have weeks of food stockpiled in the back. They do not have massive reserves sitting in warehouses ready to deploy if something goes wrong. Most grocery stores hold approximately 72 hours of inventory at any given time, 3 days. That is the buffer between the America you know and empty shelves. And the system that keeps those shelves restocked depends on a staggeringly complex and increasingly fragile supply chain that stretches across oceans, through conflict zones, down crumbling highways, and into the hands of truck drivers who are going bankrupt at record rates. When that chain breaks at any point, the food simply does not arrive. We saw this during the pandemic, and people were stunned. They could not believe that the richest country in the history of the world could run out of toilet paper and chicken. But the truth is that the system was always this fragile. We just never stress tested it before COVID, and now we are stress testing it again. But this time, the pressures are coming from every direction simultaneously. Diesel prices have surged past $5.40 a gallon nationally, which means the cost of moving food from farm to warehouse to store has jumped over 40% in 5 weeks. Fertilizer prices have spiked because the Strait of Hormuz, through which 3 of the world's top 10 urea exporters ship their product, is effectively blockaded. China, the world's largest urea supplier, has indicated it may not resume full exports until August 2026, removing millions of tons from global markets. European nitrogen production has been running at about 75% of normal capacity since 2022 because of persistently high natural gas prices from the Russia-Ukraine war. Every single input that goes into growing your food, transporting your food, and packaging your food is simultaneously getting more expensive or harder to obtain. Here is a number that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it captures the scale of what is happening inside the United States right now, and it has nothing to do with a foreign war or a shipping lane on the other side of the world. Nearly 48 million people in 18.3 million American households reported having difficulty acquiring food due to lack of resources at some point in 2024. That is 1 in 7 households in the richest nation on earth that could not consistently put food on the table. And that was before the war in Iran started. That was before diesel hit $5.40. That was before fertilizer prices jumped 39%. That was before grocery prices, which are already 29% higher than they were pre-pandemic, started climbing again. The USDA's own data showed food insecurity rising from 10.5% of households in 2020 to 13.5% in 2023 to 13.7% in 2024. The trend line is going in one direction, and it is not the direction anyone should be comfortable with. And here is the part that makes this story go from concerning to absolutely enraging. The government just stopped measuring it. The USDA announced that it is discontinuing its annual Household Food Security Report, the only comprehensive national survey that tracks hunger in America. They said it was redundant, costly, and extraneous. Anti-hunger advocates say the real reason is obvious. The administration does not want to measure the results of what is about to happen, because what is about to happen is the largest cut to food assistance in the history of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that roughly 3 to 4 million people will lose food assistance as a result of provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed in July 2025. New work requirements are being applied to more recipients. States are being forced to cover a larger share of administrative costs, with some estimates suggesting their collective burden could rise to $15 billion annually once the provisions are fully phased in. SNAP participation has already declined by 3.3 million people over the past year, and the agency that tracks whether those people are going hungry just turned off the lights and walked away. What most Americans do not understand about food is that the problem is never just about food. It is about energy. It is about chemistry. It is about geopolitics. It is about diesel and nitrogen and potash and phosphate and natural gas and shipping lanes and trade policy, all woven together in a system so complex that a disruption in any single thread can unravel the entire fabric. Let me walk you through exactly how the current crisis works, because once you see the mechanics, you will never look at a head of lettuce the same way again. Nitrogen fertilizer is the single most important input in modern agriculture. Without it, global crop yields would fall by roughly 40 to 50%. You literally cannot feed 8 billion people without synthetic nitrogen. The primary raw material for producing nitrogen fertilizer is natural gas. When natural gas prices spike, fertilizer prices spike. When fertilizer prices spike, farming costs spike. When farming costs spike, food prices spike. It is a direct mechanical transmission from the wellhead to your dinner plate. Now, the three largest global choke points for fertilizer are the Strait of Hormuz, Chinese export policy, and European production capacity. As of right now in April 2026, all three are simultaneously compromised. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed due to the Iran conflict, blocking shipments from major Middle Eastern producers. China has restricted urea exports and may not fully resume them until late 2026. European nitrogen plants are running well below capacity because gas prices remain elevated from the Ukraine war overhang. Urea prices alone have jumped 39 to 46% in recent weeks. A farmer in Iowa reported that his nitrogen fertilizer went from $795 per ton just days before the war started to $990 per ton by the end of March. That is a nearly $200 per ton increase in less than a month. And this is happening at the worst possible moment, because it is planting season. Farmers are putting seeds in the ground right now, and the decisions they make about how much fertilizer to apply, how many acres to plant, whether to plant corn or switch to cheaper-to-grow soybeans, those decisions are being made under extreme cost pressure. If farmers cut back on fertilizer to save money, yields drop. If yields drop, there is less food. If there is less food, prices go up even more. This is the vicious cycle that food security experts have been warning about, and we are now inside of it. The American farmer is being crushed from both sides right now, and what happens to the American farmer over the next 6 months is going to determine what you pay for food for the next 2 years. Think about that. The decisions being made on farms in Iowa and Nebraska and Texas and Indiana right now, this month, this week, are going to ripple forward through the supply chain and land on your grocery receipt in 2027 and 2028. Farm sector debt was already projected to reach a record $624.7 billion in 2026 before the war started. That number is going to be significantly higher now. The American Farm Bureau Federation says we are heading into year 4 of consecutive losses across the farm economy. Corn farmers need a price of roughly $4.70 to $4.90 per bushel just to break even on all costs, and current market prices are hovering dangerously close to that line. Soybean break-even prices are in the $10.80 to $11.25 range, again right at the edge. Diesel costs on the farm have increased by more than $1 per gallon year over year. For a 1,000-acre corn operation using no-till methods, that translates to an additional $9,000 in planting fuel costs alone. For hay producers, it doubles the cost per cutting. Transportation costs add another 16 to 20 cents per mile for every dollar increase in fuel price. And here is the generational dimension that nobody in Washington is talking about. The average age of an American farmer is 58 years old. Many of the farmers who are absorbing these losses right now are in their 60s and looking at retirement. The younger farmers who are supposed to take over these operations are watching their parents lose money for the fourth straight year and wondering why they would ever get into this business. One Texas farmer told NPR that he worries about the younger generation of farmers, saying some of them may not make it, and those of us who are 60 plus are asking who is going to farm this ground when we are gone. That is not just a heartwarming human interest story. That is a national security crisis in slow motion. If the next generation of farmers walks away from agriculture because the economics no longer work, the United States loses its ability to feed itself, and that is a threshold that once crossed, you cannot easily come back from. Now let me connect this to something that is happening right now in American cities and suburbs and rural towns that most people are not paying attention to, and it is going to get dramatically worse before it gets better. Food banks across the country are already overwhelmed. More than 50 million people visited a food bank in 2023, according to Feeding America, and demand has been growing every single year since. The Arlington Food Assistance Center in relatively affluent suburban Washington, D.C., now serves an average of 3,850 families per week, which is an 84% increase over the last 4 years. And these are not people living on the streets. These are working families, retirees on fixed incomes, veterans, single parents who are employed but cannot stretch their paycheck far enough to cover rent and food in the same month. Grocery prices are 29% higher than they were before the pandemic. Beef prices are at record highs, driven partly by droughts that forced ranchers to cull their herds and partly by a 76% tariff on Brazilian beef. Coffee prices are up over 20%. Eggs went through a catastrophic shortage in 2025 due to avian flu that wiped out flocks across the country. The virus devastated 1.3 million chickens at a single facility in Colorado in January 2026 alone. Since 2022, avian flu has led to the loss of nearly 185 million birds across the United States, and there is still no approved vaccine for widespread use. Cauliflower prices fluctuated by 230% in 2025 because of extreme weather in California, which grows 90% of the national supply. Olive oil has become scarce as Spain and Italy face severe drought. Frozen vegetables are harder to find because unpredictable weather patterns are hammering the farms that supply processing facilities. Meanwhile, PepsiCo announced it would reduce 20% of its production in 2026 and close 3 manufacturing plants. Aluminum prices for canning are up because of tariffs. And the federal program that helped food banks fill the gap, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, just got its funding stripped in the reconciliation bill. So at the exact moment when more Americans than ever need food assistance, the 2 largest lifelines, SNAP and food bank funding, are both being cut simultaneously. That is not a coincidence. That is a collision. And let me tell you what is waiting on the other side of that collision. Because the research is crystal clear. Kids in food-insecure households are more likely to develop mental health disorders. They score lower on math and reading tests. Working-age adults with food insecurity are more likely to develop high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis, asthma, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Low-income adults who are not on SNAP spend on average $1,400 more per year on healthcare than those who are. Every dollar spent on SNAP during an economic downturn generates up to $1.80 in economic activity because that money goes straight to grocery stores, their suppliers, truck drivers, and farmers. When you cut SNAP, you are not just taking food off someone's plate. You are pulling economic stimulus out of the exact communities that need it most, and you are loading future healthcare costs onto a system that is already buckling. 14 governors from both parties wrote to the federal government warning that if states are forced to end their SNAP programs because they cannot afford the new cost-sharing requirements, hunger and poverty will increase, children and adults will get sicker, grocery stores in rural areas will struggle to stay open, people in agriculture and the food industry will lose jobs, and state and local economies will suffer. That is not partisan rhetoric. That is a bipartisan assessment of what happens when you dismantle the country's most effective anti-hunger program during a food price crisis. There is a technological vulnerability in the American food system that almost nobody is discussing, and it was just exposed in a way that should send chills down the spine of anyone who has ever taken for granted that food will simply be there when they need it. A new study published in April 2026 revealed that the modern food supply chain has become so dependent on digital authorization systems that a simple software failure can leave grocery shelves empty even when warehouses are completely full of food. That is not a typo. The food exists. It is sitting on pallets in refrigerated warehouses, but because the digital systems that authorize its release, ensure it, verify its safety certifications, and process its shipping manifests have gone down, the food cannot legally move, it cannot be loaded onto trucks, it cannot be delivered to stores, it sits there and rots. Researchers studying UK food system vulnerabilities found that within 72 hours of a digital system failure, inventory records fall out of sync with physical reality, and manual backup procedures in many cases no longer exist because companies eliminated paper-based systems years ago in the name of efficiency. Now, add cyber attacks to the equation. We have already seen ransomware attacks shut down major food processing operations. JBS, the world's largest meat processing company, was hit by a ransomware attack in 2021 that temporarily shut down operations in the United States, Canada, and Australia. The Colonial Pipeline attack that same year disrupted fuel supplies across the entire southeastern United States. The food supply chain is running on the same kinds of digital infrastructure, and it is equally vulnerable. In a world where cyber attacks are becoming more frequent, more sophisticated, and increasingly targeted at critical infrastructure, the idea that America's food system could be paralyzed not by a drought or a war, but by a line of malicious code is no longer science fiction. It is a documented, studied, and growing risk, and there is no backup plan. There is no national strategic food reserve equivalent to the strategic petroleum reserve. When the digital systems fail, the trucks stop, and when the trucks stop, the 72-hour clock starts ticking on every grocery store in America. What keeps food security analysts up at night is not any single one of these crises. It is the convergence. It is the fact that all of them are happening simultaneously and compounding each other in ways that make the total impact far greater than the sum of the parts. The Middle East conflict is driving up diesel and fertilizer costs. Higher diesel costs are bankrupting truckers and increasing the price of moving food. Higher fertilizer costs are squeezing farmers who are already losing money. Farmers are cutting back on inputs, which will reduce yields in the fall harvest. Reduced yields mean less food entering the supply chain at higher prices. At the same time, SNAP cuts are removing millions of people from food assistance, while grocery prices are climbing to post-pandemic highs. Food banks are overwhelmed and losing federal funding. The government has stopped measuring hunger. Climate shocks are destroying crops in California, devastating olive harvests in Europe, and disrupting grain production across the developing world. Avian flu is wiping out poultry flocks with no vaccine in sight. Global grain stocks are falling despite record production, with the stock-to-use ratio dropping to 29.9%, signaling tighter supplies ahead. And only 36% of Americans have even a 3-day emergency food supply in their homes, according to FEMA. Take all of that in. Now imagine what happens when one more shock hits. A major hurricane during harvest season. A cyber attack on a critical food logistics company. A new round of tariffs on food imports. Another avian flu outbreak that wipes out millions more birds. Any one of these events, layered on top of the existing stress, could tip the system from strained to broken. And the American public, which has spent decades assuming that food abundance is a permanent, guaranteed feature of modern life, is not mentally, financially, or physically prepared for what a real food disruption looks like. I want to talk about something that does not get nearly enough attention in these conversations, and it is the global dimension of America's food vulnerability, because most Americans think of the United States as a food exporter, a breadbasket, a country that feeds the world. And in many ways that is true, but the truth is more complicated and more fragile than the mythology suggests. The United States imports roughly 15% of its overall food supply, and for certain categories, the dependence is staggering. About 60% of fresh fruit consumed in America is imported. More than 80% of seafood is imported. A huge share of specialty ingredients, spices, coffee, cocoa, and off-season produce comes from global supply chains that are now under enormous pressure. When shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz are disrupted, when fuel surcharges increase the cost of container shipping, when fertilizer shortages reduce crop yields in producing countries, all of that feeds directly into American grocery prices and availability. Coffee comes primarily from Brazil, Colombia, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. Cocoa comes overwhelmingly from West Africa. Bananas come from Central America. Avocados come from Mexico. Spices come from India and Southeast Asia. Each of these supply chains depends on affordable shipping fuel, stable trade routes, functioning port infrastructure, and predictable weather patterns, and every single one of those dependencies is currently under stress. The World Bank reported in its latest food security update that wheat prices are up 13%, maize prices up 4%, and rice prices up 5% compared to December 2025. The cereal price index is climbing, while food inflation exceeds 5% in half of all low-income countries globally. When food costs spike in developing nations, it triggers a cascade of consequences that eventually reaches the United States. Immigration pressures increase as people flee hunger. Geopolitical instability worsens as food-stressed populations become desperate. Export restrictions tighten as countries hoard their own food supplies. And the global humanitarian system, which the United States has historically funded more than any other country, comes under funding pressure at exactly the moment it is needed most. The WFP needs $13 billion to feed 110 million people in 2026, but current forecasts suggest it will receive barely half of that. Let me leave you with this, because I think it is the most important takeaway from everything I have just told you. The American food system was not designed to handle what is about to hit it. It was designed for a world of cheap energy, stable climate patterns, open trade routes, abundant labor, and functioning international cooperation. Every single one of those assumptions is now under assault. Energy is expensive and getting more expensive. Climate patterns are erratic and getting more destructive. Trade routes are disrupted by active military conflict. Labor is scarce because of immigration enforcement, an aging workforce, and years of declining interest in agricultural careers. International cooperation is fracturing as countries prioritize their own food security over global supply. And the safety nets that are supposed to catch Americans when the market fails, SNAP, food banks, federal nutrition programs, those nets are being deliberately weakened at the exact moment they are needed most. 3 million people losing SNAP benefits, food bank funding cut, the hunger measurement survey discontinued. What you are watching unfold is not a temporary inconvenience, it is a structural transformation of the food system that is going to affect every single American household, whether you make $30,000 a year or $300,000 a year. The family earning $30,000 is going to skip meals. The family earning $300,000 is going to notice that their grocery bill has quietly jumped from $1,200 a month to $1,600 a month. The farmer is going to plant fewer acres. The trucker is going to park his rig. The food bank is going to run out of donations before the line runs out of people. And the government is going to tell you that everything is fine while simultaneously turning off the instruments that would prove otherwise. People are not ready for what happens when the food runs out. They are not ready because they have never had to be. But the convergence of energy shocks, climate disruption, policy failure, and geopolitical chaos that is building right now in April 2026 is unlike anything the modern American food system has ever faced. And by the time most people realize what is happening, the shelves will already be getting thinner.